Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I will be your host. So this week, we're interviewing Manisha Thakor. How are you doing today, Manisha?
I'm doing great, Kirk. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on the show. And maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about your background before we begin.
Sure. I'm 53 years old, and I've spent the past 30 years working in financial services. I spent the first 15 years as a buy-side equity analyst and portfolio manager, overseeing large corporate accounts. And then 15 years into that, I switched gears and started focusing on advising high net worth individuals. And then most recently, I have left that chapter and moved into my board chapter of the work. And I sit on the independent mutual fund board at Lincoln Financial Group. And I have a Harvard MBA, a CFA, and a CFP.
Nice. So you like educating or getting educated. Let's talk about a little bit about your work. So we got you on the show because, in the show, we talk a lot about investing and what's going on in the world and how people can be better investors. And we also like to talk about the emotional side of money, as I call it, because it doesn't get enough airtime in many places. And I think it's probably one of the most important things that we can focus on. So tell us about your work. You've done a lot of work to help educate people about their money. So what are some of your findings? Like, what are some of the most surprising things you've found when you've done a lot of your research?
The most surprising thing I have found is that even when you educate people on good financial hygiene, how to have enough money to invest, how to think about investing, how to decide if you want to live on the passive or the index side of the business and how you want to asset allocate. If an individual does not have a healthy relationship with the role that they want money to play in their life and their relationship with money, it doesn't matter how successful they are at the other things, they're not going to feel peace. And in my case, I did all the right things in terms of the basics of personal finance on a 101, 201, and 301 level. But I was operating for the past 3 decades with a mindset of my self-worth equals my net worth. And that led me to a series of life choices that was so profoundly toxic, it resulted in a near-death illness and made me realize I needed to rethink what asset allocation looked like when you focused it on your scarce resources of time and money.
Yeah, I mean, that's, the self-worth equals net worth is a really hard one to get around. So you obviously went through your own journey to get there. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, but this is a common problem for a lot of people, right? Is we're trying to provide for our families. We're trying to, provide for our retirement and all these other things. And it's so hard to begin with. It's so easy to get stuck in that hamster wheel, if you will. So how can people kind of look at things differently and maybe try to escape that while at the same time still knowing that they have to earn money?
The formula that after 2 years of research, I ultimately ended upon as a much healthier mental model or rubric through which to think about the allocation of your time and money and to replace self-worth equals net worth is financial health plus emotional wealth equals money zen. And money zen is my long-standing word for calm, confidence, and clarity around the role of money and your relationship with money in your life. To achieve that is not to deny the importance of having money and earning money and doing healthy things with it. And it is not to say that wanting to have more is bad. What it is saying is that having more in the absence of a foundation of emotional well-being is not going to increase your life satisfaction, which for those of us who are triple type A driven, oftentimes is something that we miss.
But it kind of brings up the point, right? Is that the type A kind of personalities of, constantly driven to do more, better. I can't, well, I can sort of speak to this and kind of not, but because I'm kind of there, but how do you, if you're able to disconnect from that, right? Because there's something that's driving you. There's a hunger that's driving you to be better and to constantly excel. And are you taking away that driver, or are you kind of refocusing it in another place?
What you are doing is understanding the various elements that contribute to that drive so that you can maintain the ones that are healthy or tweak them, and you can eliminate the ones that are driving you in a way that is negative. So you're keeping the positive drivers and eliminating the negative ones. Now, this leads us into a slightly longer conversation, but it's an important one that encompasses 4 points. So what is it that leads high-performing individuals onto that hamster wheel of 24/7, 365 thoughts about work, resulting in you feeling like a human doing instead of a human being? And the 4 factors are personal small t traumas that happen before the age of 25, when our brains are fully formed. And for many of us, this is the biggest driver and probably the one we should talk a lot about. The second is cultural norms. The third are societal influences. And the fourth bucket is evolutionary biology. And so the way out of having this kind of toxic, never enough mindset is to go through all 4 of those steps. And this is what I spent 2 years researching, so that you can identify how each one of these levers may or may not impact your behavior.
Okay, that's good. Well, let's try to go through some of these, because I think this would be interesting. So let's start with cultural norms. So let's talk about, how do cultural norms affect people's drive or decision to excel at work?
The biggest cultural norm, particularly in the US, is the fact that when you meet somebody new, what do you ask them within the first 3 questions? What do you do? And then you form a judgment about them based on their answer, and they form a judgment about you based on that answer. And so we have so tightly linked our identities with what we do for a living as a proxy for who we are as a human. And if you look back historically, we've moved from having jobs to careers to callings. And so when you are feeling any kind of pain in your life, what the cultural norms are telling us to do is do more, strive more, earn more money, get a bigger title. And that's fine if that's what's intrinsically interesting to you. But there are many people I have found who reach a stage that they're now done with one pathway to achieving financial health, and they want to move over into another pathway, but perhaps it doesn't sound as prestigious, and so they don't do it. And ironically, what I found is that when people are acting from a place of intrinsic interest, their performance inherently is better, and they oftentimes reap, quote unquote, more than they might have had they stayed on the path that, from a cultural norm standpoint, gives them the biggest bang for the buck when you answer, what do you do? And I'll give one other example. There's an individual who was written about in the New York Times, And he was decided to have a series of small dinner parties where the guests didn't know each other. And the one rule was in the first 20 minutes, you couldn't talk about work and you couldn't talk about, you couldn't ask what you do. And it was a type A, high powered group. It was in New York. And people had the hardest time engaging in conversation for those 90 minutes to talk about something else. And that's what I'm referring to when I talk about cultural norms. The question to ask yourself is how deeply you identify with your work. Is that the identity you want to have? Do you want to dial it back? Are you doing work you don't like? How do you want to relate to that?
It's interesting. I remember a trip going out to California and having a conversation with somebody about this. And like in the East Coast, the question is, what do you do? And the West Coast is, where are you from? Because everybody there's a transplant, right? So, it's like, oh, where are you from? And they just naturally assume you're from somewhere else. And so I just found that to be an interesting set of questions. And maybe of West Coast dinners, they're a little different. Maybe you do ask what you do, but yeah, I mean, how do you, so when you say it's cultural norms, do you think that people can truly, I mean, obviously that's a degree in that example of the dinner parties, it's a degree of trying to create conversations outside of work. But do you think that this is actually a big struggle I've learned from men, is men more closely identify with their work being their identity, meaning their self-worth, than women do. Not that women don't, but just to degrees that men are more identify this way. And when they retire or sell a business, it's really hard. Yeah. So have you been able to distinguish the male female parts and like how people can go about that when they make that transition?
Yeah, and I think about it not as biological, but a male mindset versus a female mindset. So I definitely have a male mindset about work. It has been front and center and everything to me. I'm divorced, I'm childless, and it's been because I've put work before everything, because that's how I identify myself. And the issue is when you do that and the music stops, it can be exceptionally jarring to shift gears. And if you can implement some of those other things as you are going along, it makes the transition much smoother to a new stage, and it makes you enjoy the stage you're currently in. I think about the number of times I got off a plane at 9 p.m., went into the office, worked till 1 or 2 a.m., went home, showered, and, was back at my desk by opening bell. And, that was called being a good employee in the world of finance, not an unhealthy set of behaviors. Right. And so I think it's a recognition that even while striving, you're still a human. And if you do not invest in the emotional wealth component of your life, however you define that, whether it's family, whether it's volunteerism, and many times you don't have a lot of time when you're in certain parts of your career, so that volunteering may take a financial form, or having some type of outside interest. But I can remember talking to a self-made billionaire who was asked in front of me, what do you do for fun? And he said, work. And that person was like, no, what do you do for fun? He said, work. And he was on his third marriage and had multiple kids having multiple issues. One actually died of a drug overdose because that's what his life was. And so it's an understanding that when the music stops, if you solely identify with work, it can be really painful. And I mean, I can tell you, when I switched gears and decided I wanted to move into the corporate board stage of my life, I felt from an ego standpoint a need to tell everyone, I'm not done yet. I'm not out of the corporate world. I now sit on a Fortune 200, board, and my ego, because that's who I have been identifying with, but having gone through this process, I'm now aware of that. And I try and stop myself and answer with other questions or other answers that question, and have a different dialogue with people as a result of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great to hear. Let me ask you about the evolutionary biology of it, because obviously we've evolved as a species and at the same time we've devolved as well. So what how does that kind of come into play with all this?
Well, in interviewing evolutionary biologists, which I never thought I would do in trying to unravel this puzzle, time and again, what came up was the fact that modern society over the last 400 years has changed dramatically, but our brains, not so much, especially the subconscious parts. And so there are two examples that I'll share here of many that I highlight in the book. The first is, we used to live with seasons of scarcity and plenty. And in seasons of plenty, we were hardwired to get as much as we possibly could to sustain us through periods of scarcity, whether that was around food or water or just living conditions. But today we live in a 24/7 world of plenty. And so we're hardwired in plenty to just keep grabbing more, more, more. And blending in the cultural norms into that, we don't have a off switch that is culturally right now on a mass basis encouraged and admired to identify when your plenty bucket is full enough and when it needs to be replenished. Another fascinating element of this is, 500 years ago, if somebody had said, Kirk and Manisha, you are being sent out into the wilderness for a month, figure it out. You and I would know how to make a fire. We would know how to forage for food. We would know where to go for shelter. We would know how to meet in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, our base level needs to feel human safety. Today, what, at tiny 0.1% of humans, at least in developed countries, would know how to do that. So for most of us, money is the way we procure food, shelter, safety. And so the desire to bring more money into our lives, that's not an irrational thought from an evolutionary biological standpoint. So those are some of the things that you can, once you're aware of them, you can stop and ask, am I stuck in plenty mode? Am I grabbing after this money because I feel some type of visceral fear about my ability to provide? And if I run a Monte Carlo and I'm looking at my portfolio and my drawdown rate and or my contribution rate, my expected returns, what I think inflation's happening, am I really, like, how far on the spectrum of scary am I? And it may be really scary. You may really need to keep going, but it also may tell you that you're pretty darn close to having arrived, or you're far past having arrived.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. I've never heard anybody explain it that way. In seasons of plenty and seasons of scarcity, and we're just always on plenty. But then it makes me wonder. Well, there are people who are. It seems like they're always on scarcity because they're never working hard. So how does that play in for the people who aren't like type A?
Sure. I mean, it's the proverbial fear that what now provides for us for those base layers of security. And if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of the needs, again, if you don't meet the base layers of security around your day-to-day existence, you cannot move any further up the scale in order to self-actualize, experience joy, and really come into your own as a human. And so when you're stuck in scarcity mode, essentially what you're stuck in is that base layer mode. And the questions you need to ask yourself are, how true is this? Is this true? And thankfully, those of us that like finance, there are tools that we can use to run sensitivities and understand, well, okay, if I want the private plane life, then yeah, I am in scarcity mode relative to that. If I want a second home life, oh, well, maybe I'm not in scarcity relative to that. So again, it's not saying don't have nice things, but it's saying have a realistic, factual based viewpoint when that scarcity mindset comes up, to which you answer, is this true?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let me ask you this. So we talked about biology, we talked about cultural norms. Let's talk about the personal small t trauma.
Yeah.
Because that, I imagine there's probably a little there's probably a little stuff around that. So maybe you can explain what you mean by that.
So when I look at highly successful people, and the research shows this time and again, almost every one of them is driven by some kind of, at least in part, by some kind of incident or chapter in their life prior to the age of 25 that they developed a coping mechanism to protect themselves that was useful during that age time frame, but extrapolated and repeated through their adult life and into their working years becomes destructive. So just to give an example from my own life, I grew up mixed race in a small town in Indiana, and I was fat and chubby, and I had Coke bottle glasses, and I did not fit in with the cool crowd, and I was what we would now call extremely bullied. And that happened from fourth to sixth grade. So you'd think, get over it, Manisha. It happened in fourth to sixth grade. But what happened as a reaction to the extreme bullying and feeling so ostracized is that I looked for validation from my teachers and my academics, and I got it. I got great grades and I got accolades. Now, what happens when seeking your self worth, identity, and acceptance from that moves on into your work life? Well, what replaces that? Promotions and your annual income. And so and it's not conscious. It's generally subconscious that you're repeating these behaviors in various different ways, but they're no longer serving you. And I have been shocked at the level of executive and entrepreneur success, where in talking about this, people have done some reflection and been shocked when they see the correlation between unhealthy behaviors they're currently engaging in and what originally drove them. And so, for instance, in my case, one of the things that I kept asking myself as I was trying to journey out from this mindset of what I call the cult of never enough is, I'm not that person. Those were healthy behaviors then. Do I still need to engage in them? The answer is no. And so it's not always that black and white. For other people, it's much more nuanced. But that's one example of what I'm talking about when I speak to small t traumas.
Yeah, I think it's healthy. Some people have said in the show, I guess they would refer to it as like a money script, right? Is that we have a money script of how we look at money, and what you're talking about is more of a, it's not necessarily a money script, it's a coping mechanism, which we all, I think, have to different degrees based on our childhood experience, right? The success is usually if somebody had difficulty learning. I have a son who's dyslexic, and I've read that like 25% of the CEOs in America are dyslexic because they've had to exceed the amount that they've had to deal with to get to where they were was excessive, and that they used that, then they never shut it off.
Right.
And so to me, it's fascinating when you say the cult of never enough. Like, can you get more into that, like how that plays into this?
The cult of never enough is a mindset where you feel no matter how much you earn, no matter how many accomplishments you achieve, no matter how much praise you receive, it's never enough. You hit the milestone and it's beyond the hedonic treadmill. It's beyond that, like, okay, I got it, I'm comfortable with it, now I want the next thing. It's this deeply visceral feeling that, again, is not always conscious, that you are not enough yet. You have to achieve and earn more to really be enough. And I remember talking with the CEO and chairman of Juniper when tech executive, when I had a podcast, and he was saying that, Scott Krenz, that one of the things he noticed in his experience was every time he hit a milestone, he kind of felt like, is that it? Okay, how do I top that? And that's the kind of never enough mindset that I am speaking to when it comes to your attitude towards money, work, and careers. There's a separate never enough mindset that relates to that fourth bucket I referenced, which is societal influences.
Yeah. So let me let's get into the societal influence. Then I want to kind of wrap this back with how to actually make changes in your own life, which I think is an important part as well. So
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about the societal influences and what that impact is on people.
So I call what we're living in right now a time of counterfeit financial culture, in the sense that we are bombarded with images that bear no resemblance to economic reality. Growing up as a kid, I remember there used to be a show called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, and we didn't expect to have that. We may have decided we wanted to strive and see if we could become that, but it wasn't a general expectation that, well, of course. And part of that was because it was very difficult to get access to credit. You wanted to buy a home, well, you needed to put down 20%, and your bank was keeping that mortgage on the book, so they were going to make sure that they were confident about how you were going to pay it back. Now that we live in a world where we can get credit cards easy peasy and we can get loans and so forth, and in many cases, I want to acknowledge that that helps individuals who have not come from a financially privileged background to engage in activities that enable them to healthily invest in themselves. But what has happened now is that easy access to credit, combined with deeply unrealistic media images. Social media people joke about all the time, and it's true. Like, if you watch a family put up their photos from the vacation, all you see are the kumbaya photos. You don't see the dinner where mom and dad were giving each other the silent treatment and the kids were having a food fight. But what I discovered was, as I ran the numbers on really basic TV shows, legal dramas, police dramas, medical dramas, and you take a look at, example I'm using right now is Suits because it's trending on Netflix. So there's a paralegal on there named Donna. The show takes place in a busy city. If you look at Donna, women will get this, she has no frizz in her hair ever in a human city, which means every morning she's going for a fresh blowout. The quality of the fabric of her clothes is mind-blowing, and they're clearly tailored. You look at the kinds of socializing she does with her friends in Manhattan, the 15, now they're probably $20 Cosmopolitans and vodka tonics. And then you look at where she lives, and I went back and I did the research on multiple different professions, but when I added it up and looked at the average income for that position, then I adjusted it, assuming that this character was really good, so she was in the top quartile. She would have still needed to earn 30 to 50% more to groom and live like the character that is being portrayed. And this is consistent across almost every TV show. You will find a character like this. So we now are looking at these images and we're thinking, well, why can't I? And then in addition, when we used to compare ourselves to the Joneses next door 40 years ago, they didn't have easy access to credit either. So y'all kind of had a similar sort of lifestyle unless somebody inherited money. Today, your neighbors are using credit in different ways, and you're looking at them and thinking, well, if they can do it, I should be able to do it. And so all of this combines to create a set of societal influences that encourages us to live in a manner that for many of us is stressful because it's beyond a logical standard of living for our household income and net worth.
So the keeping up with the Joneses has been a problem for a long, long time, and I wonder if there really is a way to get out of that. And it's funny because I am not baked from that. I don't really care what people think of me. I never have. But yet, when my kids are younger, starting to play sports, you realize that you don't do it for other people. But if other people are crazy and they're, spending 10,000 on training for their kids, and you don't, like, your kids fall behind, and it's more of a, like, how do you put yourself in the best position to succeed, is not always escapable in this culture, right? And if people are doing that extra 5 yards and you don't, well, you're a bad parent, or you don't put the people that you want to in a position to succeed in the same way that others do, and it just kind of gets you into this negative feedback loop. So you're kind of forced into keeping up with the Joneses, even if you don't want to. And so how can people kind of disconnect from that?
That is a beautiful example of exactly what I'm talking about. I see this a lot in sports, with parents. And the question, I think, is one of what I call joy-based spending. Is that money being spent because your child is talented and or truly loves the learning and the training that goes along with this? Or are you doing this because you weren't that great, or you missed some milestone and now you want to ensure that your child does? So it's what's driving that. And I would argue part of the reason kids are so stressed these days is that the level of activities that they are expected to do and the amount of help and coaching and so forth that parents with means feel pressured to provide for their children is not being done from a place of investing in emotional wealth, nor does it necessarily lead to financial health for your children. Oftentimes, they may be feeling burnt out or exhausted or stressed that they're not meeting your expectations. So it really comes down to what is the root cause, which is why these 4 buckets, you don't care what other people think of you. So maybe that bucket isn't a big one for you, but maybe the cultural norm in terms of the identification with you and what you do for a living is a bigger one. And so, you asked what's the way out. People always want me to give 3 tips or 5 secrets to discovering your enough. And step number 1, and 80% of it, is examining these 4 factors. That's what is missing from our society when somebody feels burnt out and exhausted and is trying to unravel how they got there. And so that's what I would say. It is looking at that Rubik's Cube of factors to decide, do you want to spend that $10,000 on extra training? And is it joyful for everyone involved?
Yeah, no, that's really, it's funny because there's a lot of complexity around it. I know, just from my experience, I played the sport, so I This, at the time, you just kind of did it. When I was growing up, it was like you just played sports, and if you were good enough, you kept playing sports, and if you were good enough, then you did training, because then it started to get competitive. But nowadays, it's like once the kid puts on the gear, they have to, like, the parents are going crazy, and it's like, and so my whole thing, and this is maybe an isolated instance, maybe it's not, but the way I looked at it was like, my kids are good enough, then they'll play. But then I realized that the way to get them to like the sport is to get them so they're good enough. And that was the key at a young age. If you want to get them to like it, they like things they're good at, and it builds confidence, and all the positive characteristics that come along with sports come from getting good at it. But if you never get good at it because every other kid at 5 years old is like, running marathons, it's like, what is going on in this world that people are that crazy? And can't my kid just play the game? And you can't anymore. And I think that's the challenge. And sports is obviously it's an overlay for life, but it's
right.
But in looking at this, it's like, all right, I want my kid to have fun and play the game. I want them to enjoy it. I want them just to be a kid. But now you can't do that. Like growing up, I could play 3 sports. Now you can't. You can only play 1 because there's not enough time, because you got to do all these other things. And it's like, we've basically destroyed sports for kids, and we turned it into a business instead of, it's a game and it's meant to be fun. And it's no longer just a game. Now it's a business. And and maybe that's just a cultural problem that we have here in the US, where everything is business and there's no enjoyment from it. But anyway, I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole there. But
no, you're not, because what you're describing is cultural norm applied to children and sports, because that is the identity. And maybe it's not sports, maybe it's a musical instrument, but I have a niece, and she is 11, and she's extremely athletic, and she's doing triathlons. But my brother and sister-in-law are being very cautious to make sure they're enjoyable for her. And when she wants some extra training or guidance, they're not going over the top with it. And so she's having to make the decision that she wants to up her level with the limited amount of resources that my brother and sister-in-law are willing. They've put boundaries on it. They are doing extremely well. They could send her anywhere. But what they found is those boundaries have actually helped. And she does have friends who are being much more trained. This could be an N of 1, but she's happy. She's learning new skills, but it's not dominating. And yeah, she has less training than the other 11-year-olds who are doing triathlons. So I think it comes down to asking, why do you feel your child will not be able to succeed? And questioning whether that's really true.
Yeah, it's definitely a struggle. I've looked at it the same way. Like, I'm not pushing my kids any more than they want to be pushed. Although there's a bit of a boundary there. You kind of have to push them sometimes because
right.
they need to learn. So there's always a fine line. But anyway, as we get close to wrapping up here, I wanted to ask you, what are some tips that you can give people? And because you're talking about all these things, it's great to identify them. It's a great first step. But then what? Once people know that these are a problem, like, how do they go about solving these problems? Because yeah, it's great. I know I got an alcohol problem, but I don't know how to solve it. So what do I do? Right. And by the way, I don't have an alcohol problem, but anyway, my point is, just what are some tips people could have to help solve this?
By far and away, the biggest tip is to identify what is your current operating system as you look forth. Mine was self-worth equals net worth, but it can be such a wide range of things. Academics, highly successful academics, have told me theirs is the number of publications that they write and how many times those publications are cited. That's become the new competition point in academia. And so understanding whether, if your issue is self-worth versus number of citations, is that healthy? And what can you replace that with? So that's the first step. The second step is, I have found my entire life has transformed in the 18 months since I completed this research. as I now look at the way I spend my time and I ask myself, is this helping my financial health? Is this helping my emotional wealth? Do I have my asset allocation correct in terms of how much time in a day or a week or a year I'm allocating to those things? And there's seasons. There are periods where, if I'm preparing for a board meeting, I'm all in on the financial health standpoint, and my emotional wealth may not be there. But now I stop and think I need recovery time for that. I also stop and think about things like I have a second home. It's a cottage up in Maine, and I could turn it into a stunning lake house, but I'm asking myself, actually, it's a 1915 original camp, which is what they call them up in Maine. And if I change it, it's going to not be the experience that I want. Whereas by contrast, I just bought a condo in DC. I'm moving cross country to be near family, which is one of the things I learned I was lacking in the emotional wealth area. And I'm going to do more renovations there. And so, what it comes back to is an awareness that, especially those of us who are in finance, are subconsciously so honed in on financial, in most cases, wealth and growing it, that we don't think about those other areas. And so, one of the things I did in writing this book was create, and I know guys won't like this. I didn't like it either because I have a very male mindset about things, but I created a reflective journal so that as you go through the steps and you unpack how you ended up on the hamster wheel, you can then start to identify what specific steps you need to take in each of those two areas, because they differ for each one of us. And for anyone who's like, okay, who's this woo-woo crazy woman? What I would tell you is one of the strongest trends we're seeing in, particularly it's starting right now in high net worth wealth management, is this trend towards financial life planning, where these other elements are incorporated. And now, in addition to a CFA, a CFP, there's a growing movement. There's an organization, the Financial Therapy Association, that's putting out a curriculum and a designation. And what I have found back when I was working for large wealth management firms where 80% of the advisors were men, 20% were women, that's just kind of the standard, is many of the men found that this exercise led to an unbelievable stickiness in terms of client retention and an increase in client referrals, because it solves such a visceral problem beyond money. And so, my biggest tip is, first and foremost, to acknowledge if you have a faulty operating system or an operating system that is outdated and no longer serves you. That's the most important thing to start with.
Great. Well, Manisha, I really appreciate you coming on the show. Where can people find more about you?
I like simplicity. Everything about me and my new book, Money Zen, The Secret to Finding Your Enough, is at moneyzen.com.
Awesome. That's simple enough. Well, once again, Manisha, I really appreciate you coming on the show, sharing your wisdom with us. This has been great. I love talking about this stuff. I could talk about it all day. I think it's not talked about enough, unfortunately, and it could be one of the most important things, because what good is money if your life stinks? So thanks again for sharing, and we'll have you back on in the future.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room, as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room. All right, well, that was a great interview with Manisha. I really appreciate her coming on the show. Now we're into the panel portion of the show where we have our very own Barb Friedberg. Hey, Barb.
Hi, happy to be here.
Glad to have you. And we also have our very own Phil Weiss. Hey, Phil.
Hey, Kirk. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So Barb, yeah. So what were some of your takeaways from the interview?
I followed Manisha for many, many years online. We've had a couple of email exchanges over the years and watched her transition. The one thing that really spoke to me was your wealth equals your net worth, because that has been my albatross around my neck for many, many years. And now that I'm getting ready to have reached our wealth goals, I'm getting ready to cut back on work a little bit and transition into the next phase of my life. I am working furiously to minimize that faulty belief. And so I liked the idea she had and the ways that you kind of tackle who you are and how you view money.
Money is such a central part in our lives and our kind of worth and how we perceive ourselves. It's so very complicated, and we think it's just so very simple. Phil, what about you? What are some of your takeaways?
So one thing that I thought about that I thought was interesting was you started to talk about never enough. And I have a client that I've been working with her for about 3.5 years now. And back around this time, a little later than this time last year, she sent me this email that she was feeling really stressed at work, and she was taking leave. She took 12 weeks off to figure out, like, she was just under stress and pressure. She'd been working since she was 14 and she was too stressed out. And we started talking. We decided to work on her life plan. And as we did that, I had shared my life plan with her, and she said, "Thank you, because I've been sitting here just trying to build the biggest pile of money. And I never really thought about why or what it meant." And after seeing that, she realized that she didn't have to keep building because they had more than enough. I mean, she and her husband both had good jobs, making good income, and they were living on one income. So they basically were banking and saving and investing one of their incomes. So now we worked on her life plan. We helped her figure out what she wanted to do. She's now retired. She's in her early 50s. She's retired, and it's something they can easily manage. And like, when I look at her and I talk to her, she's a different person. And it was all realizing that she had enough, and she didn't really know why they kept trying to save more and more and more. It was, you get on that hamster wheel and just keep doing it without really realizing why.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like that conversation comes up more often than other conversations. And I think part of it is it's a generational thing. Like, if you think of the boomer generation, I say all of them, but most of them, they worked really hard. They saved the money, they worked. It's just, generationally, it's just something they did, right? You work hard, you save money. And then you retire, and it's like, all right, now I have to go from working hard and saving to not working and spending. That's a huge habit change. 40 years of working hard, saving money, and now you got to shift and spend it. that's hard. Like people don't change that easily, right? Somebody tried to describe like habits as like, you think habits are basically in your brain. You've got your the myelin sheaths connecting the nerves, and it's like you're wrapping duct tape around that. The more you do a habit, it's like more and more duct tape. It's like you're cementing the habit the more you do it. So 40 years of that, you're just gonna be like, all right, I'm gonna stop saving and just spend everything. Like that's, I mean, I've talked to clients, it takes like 6, 12 months to get them to change, to actually like be comfortable with the fact that they're no longer going to be saving, they're going to be spending, and like, oh my God, I'm going to run out of money. Like you could have like a bazillion dollars, you're still going to feel like I'm going to run out of money. And I think it's a very human thing to do, but it's yeah, these conversations happen all the time. So like Barb, like what is, like I assume you're kind of going through this at this stage of your life at some level. So like how do you handle that?
Well, you literally, Kirk, just described my scenario. I am in the middle of the baby boomer generation. And although neither my husband and I are retiring full time, we are both in a process of cutting back. We are, you know, we're going to be hitting our 70s very, very soon. And the question is, how many years left do you have after that to actually, um, maybe minimize work and do other things in your life? And it's a very privileged problem to have reached our final goals because we've all been working forever and saving and scrimping and not spending. And like Kirk said, when you've reached your financial goals, and again, I say we are very privileged, we've worked very hard to get to that point, deciding what is our purpose now and what is our meaning now and how are we going to live from here on out, and will we run out of money? Nobody can predict the future. Life is always uncertain. And will we end up in a nursing home or sick for many years, which will rip through all of our money? So you ask me, what am I doing now? It's like confronting the reality that life is uncertain, doing the best that I can to balance living within our goals, spending on things that matter to us, enabling ourselves to accept the fact that we're not going to be saving anymore. The saving days are over, and that's okay.
Yeah, it's I appreciate you sharing that, Barb. It's yeah, I mean it's hard. I mean you use the word privilege, which in this this culture has different meanings, but I agree. Like there were times like 50 years, I don't know, 50 years ago or whatever it was, where people didn't retire, they just kept working, or they found something to do. Like when you didn't, it wasn't saving enough, you just kept working. Like people just worked till they died, or they found other functions, right? But we live in this world where we have the ability to save enough where we could just step back and do nothing. um and it's an interesting cultural change, because what's going to happen if we don't live in this economy where abundance is everywhere, like we've had for like the last 15 years? Like there will be times where we'll have rough times, like that's inevitable. So what do people do? How do they handle it, right? We have family structures that are not as strong as they used to be, but that's a lot of these countries that don't have as much wealth, like they have really strong family structures that take care of each other. So it just kind of brings up some cultural shifts, which I think are really important. But Phil, what about you? Like, how do you kind of look at these cultural shifts when you're working with clients?
It's really just interesting. I think back to one of the first clients that I worked with, and such a mind shift change had to happen. He'd worked for the government and he had a pension, and he had diligently contributed to his TSP, which is the government version of a 401k. And when you looked at how much money he had there and his pension and his Social Security benefit, they didn't even want to spend, or weren't planning to spend, what they were going to be taking in. So if they just did that, they could have actually saved while they were in retirement. And asking do I have enough? Can I retire? And it's like this whole mind shift change that you have to talk to people about, because they had more than enough. I'm like, take another trip, go do these other things. And so that's why, as I've grown my business, I've added life planning, because life planning is meant to help you explore those things that really matter to you and identify them, so that you can start to match your spending with what matters to you, because that becomes so important. And not everybody's in that really privileged position that I just described that one client is in, where they have enough to do what they want and then figure out what else they can do. But a lot of times we look and see what other people have, and we think we want the same thing, but we don't know what it took to get there. I had a client that told me a story that this family, when she was growing up, they had this house outside. It was beautiful. It looked so wonderful, but they would never let anybody in the house. And one day she went inside and she found out why. They had like no furniture. There was like nothing in it. It was all the appearances from the outside that really mattered to that family. But when you make those choices, you want something, sometimes you have to give something else up. So a lot of times it's that give and take, right? What is it that I really want? And if I really want that, what might I have to give up to get it? So there's a lot of conversations around things like that.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a great point, Phil, about like keeping up with the Joneses. And, it's been such a big part of culture for the last few decades. And it's the wrong way to do things, but it's, as I think I mentioned on the interview, like growing up, like I was very anti keeping up with the Joneses. Don't care socially, just don't care. If you don't think I'm cool, good for you. Like I really don't care. However, when you got kids, it's really hard to escape that, right? Like it's not just like I don't care if my kid's getting an A+ in math. I don't need to send them to, special math school, Russian math, Singapore math to make sure that they're keeping up with everybody else. But if everybody's doing that, it puts you in a position of like, well, then your kid ends up being the dumb kid, even if they're getting an A. Like it's not just relative to everybody else. Your kid's the dumb kid, even though they're like still doing well. So it's kind of like, what am I doing as a parent? And I always struggle with this because you look at it like, I know when kids played sports and hockey, and I never wanted to be like that crazy parent like some of them are, like putting their kid, just burning their kid out because they're playing all year long. So I wanted the kids to kind of develop that in their own. But at a certain level, if you don't do that, then you don't keep up. Then your kid's behind, and then you can't catch up. So it's kind of, you get caught in this hamster wheel of like, what do you really want for your kids? If you want the best for your kids, in some ways you have to do that, or else you feel like a bad parent, right? Like my wife and I talk about this. Like, do I want to be sitting there when I'm in a rocking chair and I'm retired and my kid comes to me and said, I wish you pushed me harder. I wish you did this for me. Like that would just kill me. I'd probably have a heart attack right there if my kid told me that. Like I didn't do enough. So like we have a guy at our firm, Jack, who specializes in college planning, and we had these conversations with parents all the time. It was like, what do you want for your kid? I want them to go to the best school. Okay, but what does that mean? And it's like, and you stop to think about it and you have the conversation. It's like, do I want to be the parent that says, yeah, you could have gone to Harvard? Well, Harvard's a bad example because no one's going to Harvard now, but I could have gone to, well, I can't even think of, because they're all in the same boat. I could have gone to the best school out there, whatever that means to you. And, but, I decided you're not going there. You're going to a state school because I didn't want to spend the money because I wanted to put the money towards my retirement, or I didn't do it because of ABC. And the kid's like, the kid doesn't have all the opportunity you want to give them. Like as a parent, like my priorities are my kids. Like I'll wear bags for clothes for years if it helps me spend money on my kids in the right way. Like it's just, my kids are my priority, as it is probably for most parents. But like, how do you prioritize that, right? And when you're trying to keep up with the Joneses, and you're also not, because you can't escape it unless you're living in a kind of more rural town where that doesn't exist. But like, I'm sure it exists at some level. But how do you do that? Like, Barb, how should people be thinking about this in a way that's constructive and not destructive to their life?
You asked the $50 million question, Kirk, because you can't escape it. If you watch media, any media, you and your children are bombarded, even more so than when the three of us were growing up, with these images of and many of them are false images of how people are living, and you believe the reality is some unrealistic view of how you need to look, of how you need to act, of where you need to go to school, of what you need to achieve. And I think as a parent, it's our responsibility to keep our kids grounded. And because we only had one child, we could have given her whatever she wanted within, of course, reason. We didn't do that because that's not good for her. I remember now looking back on my parents when they said no to things. Of course, I was furious. Why can't I have this? I remember everyone went to a trip to Washington from my school in Ohio. My parents said, no, it's not in the cards right now. And I felt horrible. But as an adult, I have tremendous ambition. I have goals. I have very sensible money ambition. And that's because I've had to work for things. My daughter's incredible. She's an adult, she's married, she's very sensible with money, and she's very ambitious. And that's because she had to deal with the struggle. Now, many parents don't have to impose a struggle because it's already there. But you cannot do everything for your kids. You can't give them everything, or they will turn out as lazy and spoiled, and they won't have the drive that they need as adults. And they need to understand that what you see in the media is not reality. Easier said than done, right?
Yep. Very much easier said than done. But I appreciate the story, Barb, because I think that's important. I think a lot of people struggle with that, and they say, "Well, I'll just put it on the credit card, and I don't want to disappoint my kid."
Growing up, my parents had a mortgage on their house, which they paid off early. My in-laws never had any debt. Any. They lived in a house that was a two-family house that was owned by my mother-in-law's mother, my husband's grandmother, and they paid cash for their cars. And, my parents too. I mean, they bought my dad was like all into the fancy cars. So he'd buy a used Lincoln or a used Cadillac for cash. The kind of habits they had, yeah, they used credit cards, but they paid them off at the end of every month. The idea of debt was just, it was just not even considered. It wasn't an option. I went to university in the 70s. I went to a state school, and myself and my parents paid for my education without any debt because, of course, back then it was affordable. So that's a whole nother story. But before I get off my soapbox, I'm a big fan of let your kids go to either a technical school, a trade school, if that's suitable for them. Let them go to community college for a couple years and transfer out so you don't start your lives with $100,000 of debt.
Yeah, the good old days when caddies were cool.
I know.
We had caddies growing up, and it was cool. Like it was a
I
cool car. Not
know.
anymore.
Oh my gosh. I still love them, from that programming when you grow up. Every time I see one, I say, Bob, should I get a Cadillac? And of course, I'm the one that, buys the middle market car and then drives it forever. And so I know I'm never going to buy a Cadillac, but oh my gosh, Kirk.
Back then, you could drive them forever.
Well,
I mean, they were boats, but they would, except for the mid 70s where they made a really crappy car. Like
yeah.
my parents had them, and they would drive them. I mean, my dad had this one car, the Blue Bomber, he used to call it. The thing was, he had it for like 10 years, and I mean, he used to hit so. Can't tell you how many things he hit with that thing. It was still going. Like it didn't. It's like you hit a brick wall, and the brick wall's like, oh, let me get out of your way. Like it's just the thing is just it's a tank. But back then they started making these new cars, and they're just different. It's not the same. But Phil, what about you? I mean, raising a kid today versus the 80s I mean, it's a very different time. I mean, I know when I grew up, I think about, like, I went to private school, and so a lot of my friends went to private school because, friends with them since then. And so you kind of stay in similar circles. And I don't look at public private people differently, but definitely you tend to gravitate towards people from there because you're from there, right? And the circles interchange. It's like, I don't know if we told this on the show before. I know Bar will get a kick out of this, but it's like, these competitive women that want to go to, like, Harvard for an MBA, because they want, like, to get competitive jobs, and then they end up marrying a guy from Harvard, MBA school, and then they go work at home because he's got a job. It's like it not characterizing this. Hopefully, I'm not characterizing it improperly, but basically, if you think about it, it's like, if you're hanging out in those social circles, you're going to meet people in those social circles, right? And so, if that's what you want, and some people, that's what they want for their kids, right? Is to be in those social circles so their kids can interchange. Now, one of my friends, I talked to him, he's got 3 girls, and I said, "Oh, you're going to send your girls to private school?" He's like, nope, they're going to public. I'm like, "Yeah, but don't you want your girls to marry a guy of a certain, like, not standing, but like of certain kind of like wealth or whatever, because he's got some money." And he's like, "I don't care." It's like, they'll figure it out. I'm like, okay, like, I respect that. But there's so many people that they want the brass ring, or whatever you call it nowadays. They want to be up there with everybody else, and it's a hard conversation. Like, how do you? Some people value it, some don't, and then some people say, "Oh, those people are snooty," and it's like, yeah, some of them are, but there's a lot of them aren't. I mean, they're good people. They just, for one reason or another, just chose that route. So, I don't know. How do you look at it, Phil? I mean, you talked about earlier, and how people in your area are just, they talk about, oh, what school did you go to? And they don't do that up here, but it definitely comes in the conversation for sure.
So there's a couple of things I want to say. So first, I'll say I'm not going to get into my whole story here, but I had growing up all the wrong role. My father was the worst possible role model, so I learned everything not to do, and that's how I got to figure out the right stuff. Because if I looked at what he did, if I did the opposite, I was probably a lot better off. But
Please get into it. Now you've piqued our
Seriously,
interest. You
Phil, come
can't
on.
leave us
You
hanging
can't leave the
here.
listeners hanging here. They're on the edge of their
Yes,
seats,
we
driving in their
we
car.
have
Come on.
to know the
okay,
ins and the outs, Phil.
all right. So this is so growing up in my house, my father was responsible for the finances, and that was the typical model back then. But he was not good at it at all. We had our electricity turned off, we had our phone turned off, we had cable turned off, all those things, so he didn't pay the bills. It got so bad that my father actually forged my name so he could get credit cards because he had no credit. And I went to Duke for 3 years. I was a psychology major and a pre-med, and I had to leave because my father stopped paying. Oh, my mother, meanwhile, she went back to school in her 40s and became an occupational therapist. And I know that the reason that she did that was to be able to stand on her own because it was not a good situation. While all that was going on, she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. She asked me to help, and that's when we figured out and realized how bad things really were. Like the credit cards that my father had gotten, like after I told them they were forged, the banks just put them in my father's name because he had been making at least payments on them, something he rarely did, but he did it then. And they had to move out of their house because it was going to be foreclosed. So my mother asked me to help. I tried. I did what I could, but unfortunately, my mother passed. Her breast cancer metastasized to her brain. And so that's really the motivation behind my business and why I work with women, because I'm trying to help keep other women from going through the things that my mother did. And part of my life plan, I talked about life planning before, the first element of my life plan, and I started seeding it last year, is to ultimately create a scholarship for women who go back to school later in life so that I can help them because I know what it was like for my mom.
Wow. I love that, Phil. Thank you for sharing that. That was an unbelievable story. And
Well, thanks.
I mean, that's what drives a lot of us, is that life story, right? And you obviously have a big driver, and I appreciate that. And, Barb and everyone else listening to the show, we all have our own drivers. And I think, being honest about it is important, right? Because it's our roadmap that we have on life. All we have a roadmap is what we learned, rightly or wrong. Like you said, you learn what not to do. like I think about this all the time. Like I think about my being raised as a kid, and then how I raise my kids is reflective of what had been done with me, right or wrong. Like there were some things that they did. I was like, oh, I'm definitely doing that. And their kids, there were things I'm like, I am never doing that to my kids. Like that is just totally wrong. But it's, that's how we learn. I don't know how you were raised, so I don't have anything to say like, oh, I want to raise my kids like Phil. Like I have no idea. Like we only know the imprint that we get from childhood. We don't know other people's imprint, so it's really hard to escape that. So what I know we're gonna kind of wrap it up here in the interest of time, but final thoughts from you, Phil, on that, or really any of the other stories you kind of brought up.
So one of the things that you're bringing up is that so much of what many of us think about money is shaped in childhood. Right? The way we think about money. So it's something that I'll try to explore a little bit with clients, trying to understand what are their drivers, what is it, where did their what are their earliest money memories, and what kind of impact did they have? Because they impact a lot of what we do later in life. A lot of people that have trouble spending, it could be because money was tight, so they were always afraid to spend. And there's actually, in the training that I've done, they go through the 7 stages of money maturity, and it starts with innocence, which is your childhood state where money doesn't play any real role in your lives. And it goes all the way through. And the last stage is aloha, where you practice compassion and service of others without expecting anything in return, but you advance through life in these different money stages. So much of it comes from when we're little. And for me, it's like there's always the give and take with the kids, right? Like you want your kids to be happy. You want to give them things that they want, but you can't let them have everything, because they're never going to learn discipline if you don't. So it's a struggle, just like when you figure out for your own life. I want to save for retirement. I want to send my kids to college. I want to have some experiences. So there's always a balance that we have to strike.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Phil. So where can people find more about you, Phil?
The experience big life transitions can be stressful. My job is to help empower women facing new beginnings with the financial knowledge and tools they need to make self-assured decisions. My firm's Apprise Wealth Management. You can download my free ebook, How to Flourish Through Life's Big Changes, at apprisewealth.com/ebook. And you can also sign up for my blog. And thanks for having me today, Kirk.
Yeah, thanks for going on, Phil. And Barb, final thoughts from you.
I love this conversation because it's so real. And we all have so much history that is driving who we are today. Additionally, we have the images that are bombarding us with ideas that we're not enough, that we're not good enough, that we're not rich enough, that we don't have enough. And to be able to take a step back and try and figure out, what do you really want? Who are you? What are your values? Because most of us will never have the resources to have everything. And so we need to figure out what is important to us. And then we need to characterize what is our mission. The thing that has helped me transition from, or that is helping me transition from, my self-worth equals my net worth, is to realize that my goal is to give to others, to help others in their journey in whatever way that I can. And I'm not a financial advisor, so I do a lot of writing on my blog and also in my day-to-day life. My mission is changing to define myself not from my net worth, but from what am I giving back? How am I becoming the kind of person that people look at and say, she's there for me? And with that, you can contact me via email or watch my videos or visit my blog at Barbara Friedberg, Personal Finance. You can also find me across the internet writing about a lot of smart investing topics. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on, Barb. That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.